An airport worker tripped a black teen in a fit of cruelty. Seconds later, his father stepped in and shattered the guard's arrogance in front of the whole terminal. What happens next will leave you speechless. He stuck out his foot, tripping a teen carrying his baby brother, sending both crashing to the ground. Subscribe if you believe no one is above the law. The first scream echoed through the terminal long before anyone noticed who it belonged to. A baby's cry, sharp, rising, urgent, cut through the cluttered sounds of rolling suitcases, boarding calls, and casual airport chatter. It came from Concourse D of Kessler International Airport near Gate 43, and was followed by the muffled thud of a body hitting tile. But 2 minutes earlier, the scene had been quiet. 16-year-old Darian Voss moved through the crowd like a thread pulled between chaos. His arms were full, one carefully looped under the soft weight of his baby brother, Kai, who clung to him with wide, curious eyes. The boy's other shoulder held the strap of a blue backpack that shifted with every careful step. His sneakers squeaked softly against the polished airport floor, scuffing just slightly as he adjusted his footing to avoid brushing against the sea of travelers darting around him. His father, Marcus Voss, walked just ahead. Tall and lean, he had the presence of someone who carried authority quietly. His head turned with subtle precision as he scanned the crowd, protective, vigilant. His steps slow enough to let Darian keep pace, fast enough to clear space. He didn't talk, but his silence was loud. Every few seconds he glanced over his shoulder at his sons, checking for danger, making sure the space around them remained clear. Marcus trusted few people in crowded places, especially airports, especially now. Darian's focus was tight. He rocked Kai gently with each step, muttering soft sounds in the baby's ear. The baby let out a small yawn and buried his face against Darian's chest. The boy's heart swelled. Moments like this made him feel older than 16. Not in a burdensome way, but in a way that made him feel important, strong, like his dad. A group of businessmen passed by briskly, bumping his backpack. Darian turned sideways to shield Kai instinctively, muttering a quiet sorry, even though the fault wasn't his. He exhaled slowly, double-checking Kai's position, adjusting the baby's hat to shield his eyes from the blinding ceiling lights. The stroller had been checked in earlier, there was no going back for it now. All he had were his hands and his awareness. And yet, as he moved through the corridor between Gate 41 and 43, something shifted in the atmosphere. He didn't notice it at first, but Ryland Doran did. Ryland stood with one foot resting against a metal post near a charging station, arms folded, posture loose. His bright orange vest labeled him as airport security, but he wore it with disdain, as if he resented the role. His dark eyes locked onto Darian, narrowing as the teen approached with the baby in his arms. Ryland's jaw clenched once, then relaxed into a smirk. "Too young to be carrying that much responsibility," he muttered under his breath unnoticed. He stepped forward just slightly, barely enough to be considered movement, but his eyes remained trained on Darian. To anyone else he looked bored, but beneath the casual lean was something sharper, uglier. Ryland didn't move like someone doing his job. He moved like someone waiting for a moment to strike. Darian felt it too late. He adjusted Kai with both hands, momentarily shifting his weight to his left foot. The movement left his right side exposed, the backpack strap slipping slightly down his arm. He took one more step, and that's when Ryland extended his boot. It wasn't clumsy, it wasn't accidental, it was timed. A subtle, surgical nudge, low to the ground, quick, invisible to most. Darian's foot clipped hard against the obstruction. The forward momentum threw him off balance instantly. His body pitched forward, and all he could think about was Kai. He twisted mid-fall to protect the baby, his own arm landing beneath them both. The impact was brutal. Darian hit the floor with a sickening smack. His right wrist cracked beneath the force, and his shoulder slammed into the tile. Kai shrieked, startled and hurt, his small body bouncing against Darian's chest before the teen pulled him close again with trembling arms. The entire terminal paused. The squeal of suitcase wheels ceased. The intercom continued, oblivious. But human sound, the conversations, the footsteps, the laughter, stopped in a single breath. Marcus turned sharply, his head snapping toward the sound of his sons hitting the ground. "Darian!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the silence like a whip. The boy lay curled on the floor, face twisted in pain, holding Kai protectively with one arm and cradling the other against his body. Tears welled in his eyes, not just from the injury but from fear, from confusion, from shame. He blinked quickly, trying to stay calm for Kai's sake. Marcus was already running. He reached them in seconds, kneeling beside them, his hands scanning both sons for signs of injury. His fingers were gentle on Kai's back but firm on Darian's shoulders, guiding him upright. Kai sobbed against Darian's neck, and Marcus saw the faint red mark on the baby's cheek from where his head had bumped during the fall. Then Marcus looked up. Rylan stood just a few feet away, arms slightly raised, eyebrows high as if surprised. "Hey," he said, voice loud enough for others to hear. "Wasn't me." Kid just tripped. But Marcus had seen it. That smirk, that pause, the slight movement of the foot, the kind of cruelty that hides behind plausible deniability. A father's instinct didn't need evidence. It only needed that look. Rylan shifted back a step, hands still raised as if innocent. But Marcus had already made his decision. He stood slowly, eyes locked on the worker. The surrounding crowd began to murmur. Phones rose into the air. Someone whispered, "I think he tripped him." Another said, "That kid's arm looks broken." Darian coughed and whispered through clenched teeth, "He tripped me, Dad." I swear Marcus's breath grew heavy. The world around him seemed to dim, tunnel vision narrowing everything to one focus. He looked down at his sons, hurt, crying, trembling, and then back at the man still pretending nothing had happened. Some people stumble, some people fall. But this wasn't a fall. It was a choice. Marcus clenched his fists, stepping forward once. And above the chaos, above the noise, above the rising panic of the crowd and the sting of fluorescent lights, a single thought burned in his mind. Some falls are not accidents, they are invitations to chaos. Rylan Doran's eyes narrowed as he saw the perfect moment approaching. Darian Voss, 16 years old and visibly focused on holding his baby brother, was just a few steps away. The teen adjusted his grip on the infant, his other arm shifting slightly to balance the backpack slipping off his shoulder. That was Rylan's cue. With a slight bend of his knee and a subtle thrust of his boot, he extended his foot across Darian's path. Precise, deliberate, and cruel. The contact was instant. Darian's sneaker clipped against the outstretched boot, sending him stumbling forward with no chance to regain balance. His body pitched violently ahead, instinctively curling around Kai to protect the baby. The scream that tore from Kai's tiny lungs pierced the terminal like a blade, stopping conversations mid-sentence. Darian's arm shot out to break their fall, but the angle was wrong. His wrist bent with a sickening crack as it collided with the cold tile floor. Kai's head bumped against Darian's chest, cushioned but still jolted by the fall, his cries rising in sharp, panicked pitches. For a brief second, the terminal stood still. Luggage wheels stopped rolling. Boarding announcements faded beneath the rising chorus of gasps and murmurs. Time seemed to slow as Darian's face contorted in pain, his broken wrist trembling beneath him. His other arm clutched Kai protectively, his body curled as a barrier despite his agony. Marcus Voss turned around at the exact moment the silence began to fracture. His sharp eyes landed on his sons, his oldest son on the floor, arm twisted unnaturally, baby crying in his arms and his heart clenched like a vice. His stomach dropped. His instincts, honed by years of experience and quiet vigilance, screamed that this was no accident. He saw the smirk first. Rylan stood just feet away, his posture nonchalant, but his face betrayed the truth. That slight curl at the edge of his mouth, the way his eyes flicked with false innocence, confirmed everything Marcus needed to know. The man had done it on purpose. Darian gasped through clenched teeth, trying to shift his weight off his broken hand. "Kai, he's okay, I think," he whispered, voice trembling but steady. The baby's cries grew louder, echoing off the tile and glass. People began to move, some stepping forward, others backing away. Phones came out of pockets like weapons drawn in a silent standoff, recording what might become something more. Marcus dropped to one knee beside his sons. He gently took Kai from Darian's arms and cradled him, checking his head, brushing his fingers over the baby's fine curls. No blood, no swelling, just terror in the boy's eyes. Still, Marcus's chest remained tight, the adrenaline spiking as he turned his attention to Darian. "Can you move it?" he asked softly, touching Darian's injured hand. Darian winced, shaking his head. "I heard it pop," he said, voice strained with pain. Marcus's jaw tightened. His hand hovered near his son's wrist but didn't touch it again, not wanting to worsen the damage. His eyes flicked back to Rylan, who now had the audacity to raise his hand slightly, as if to protest innocence. "Hey, I didn't do anything." Ryland said aloud, voice just loud enough for the nearby onlookers to hear. Kid wasn't watching where he was going. Marcus didn't respond. Not yet. His breathing slowed, deliberate, controlled. He placed Kai down gently beside Darian, using the baby carrier as a cushion, then rose to his full height. The crowd parted instinctively. Something about Marcus's presence, his steady movements, his burning stare, was enough to warn people that the moment had shifted. Darian's eyes widened as he looked up at his father. He had seen that look before, but never this close. It wasn't fury. It was something colder, deeper, like a storm gathering beneath a silent sky. "Dad," he said quietly, "he tripped me." The words were soft but cut through the air like a knife. There was no mistaking it now. No chance for Ryland to backpedal or laugh it off. Darian's voice carried pain and certainty, and the crowd responded in ripples, murmurs turning into pointed glances, suspicion creeping into expressions. Someone whispered, "Did you see that guy stick his foot out?" Another voice answered, "I think I got it on camera." Ryland's smug demeanor began to crack. His eyes darted from Marcus to the growing crowd, then back to the teen on the ground. He took a step back, lifting his hands higher. "Look, man, it was an accident. I swear." The kid just tripped, but Marcus was already moving. He stepped forward slowly, deliberately, each footfall as heavy as judgment. The air thickened. Passengers moved aside like the tide parting for something ancient and immovable. His voice, when it came, was low and restrained, but laced with a fury that curled around each syllable. "You tripped my son." It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. Ryland's throat bobbed as he swallowed. It wasn't like that," he stammered. "I didn't mean he was in the way." Marcus took one more step, now just inches away. "He was carrying a baby," he said. "My grandson. And you stuck your foot out." From the floor, Darian's voice was strained but clear. "He did, Dad." I saw him move around them. The tension thickened. A few passengers began to back up, sensing the coming escalation. Others pressed in, phones held steady, recording. The terminal's chatter had become a distant hum, every attention locked on the still, quiet standoff between a father and a man who had crossed the line. Ryland opened his mouth to protest again, but Marcus didn't need more words. His silence was louder than anything Ryland could say. And in that silence, Marcus saw everything clearly. His son in pain, his baby grandson crying, and a man standing without remorse. The storm inside him was no longer something to hold back. It had been invited. Sometimes the smallest shoved tears open the deepest storm. Darian hit the floor hard. The sharp slap of bone against tile echoed louder than it should have, cutting through the chatter of the terminal like a blade. His breath caught in his throat as his arm twisted beneath him at a painful angle. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt and blur around him. Then came Kai's scream, raw, high-pitched, terrified. The baby had landed partially on Darian's chest, his tiny hands still gripping the fabric of his brother's shirt, but his head had bounced lightly off Darian's collarbone in the fall. His cries now cut through the air, piercing and panicked, making heads turn. Darian's jaw clenched as he tried to sit up, but a bolt of pain shot through his left hand, making him wince and drop back to the floor. He clutched his wrist instinctively, feeling the strange stiffness of something broken. The pain was sharp and immediate, but his fear for Kai overwhelmed it. He shifted his body to protect the baby, curling slightly, shielding his little brother with whatever strength he had left. His legs trembled. His heart pounded. A shadow dropped beside him. "Marcus?" The boy's father moved with urgency, dropping to one knee in a single, fluid motion. His large hands moved with care, first checking Kai's head, then brushing a hand across Darian's cheek. Marcus's expression was carved from stone, his jaw tight, his eyes flickering between concern and something far colder. "Are you okay?" he asked in a low voice, his hand hovering just above Darian's shoulder as if afraid to press down and hurt him more. I think my hand's broken," Darian muttered through shallow breaths. "Kai, he's crying, but I think he's okay." "He's okay, right?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He ran his hand along the back of the baby's head, then nodded. "No bleeding. No bruising yet. He's scared. Just scared." A few feet away, Ryland Dorn stood with his hands raised slightly, as if putting on a show for the gathering crowd. His eyebrows lifted, a mock expression of innocence painted on his face. His mouth formed the words, "Didn't see him," though no sound came out. But Marcus saw the truth in the man's eyes. Not regret, not worry, satisfaction. He rose slowly, his body blocking the view of his sons from the people who had started pulling out their phones. Whispers were already circulating through the cluster of bystanders, some unsure of what had happened, others forming their own versions of the story. A few muttered to themselves, too far away to hear clearly. But it was the silence between the whispers that Marcus heard most clearly. The tension of judgment, the pause of uncertainty, the unspoken, "What will the father do next?" Darian lifted his head and looked past his father toward the man who had done this. His voice trembled as he said, "He tripped me, Dad." The words were soft, but in Marcus's ears they cracked like thunder. The air seemed to freeze around him. The truth had been spoken, not assumed, not guessed. Spoken. Confirmed. His son had seen it clearly. The trip hadn't been an accident. It had been deliberate. Calculated. Marcus's eyes, already darkened by concern, now narrowed into something far sharper. He turned toward Rylan, studying every detail, the relaxed slouch, the hands held high, the slight curl at the corner of his mouth, the way he leaned back with confidence. The man wasn't afraid. Not yet. Rylan shifted his weight casually, stepping backward as if distancing himself from the scene. His posture was loose, casual, too casual for someone who had just watched a baby fall. Marcus took one step forward. Rylan raised both hands slightly higher. Hey, I didn't touch him," he said with a chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. "Kid must have tripped on his own." Another whisper rose from the crowd. Phones angled higher now. Recordings were in full swing. Darian struggled to sit upright behind his father, Kai still wailing softly in his lap. "Dad," he said, his voice weak. "Don't." But Marcus didn't respond. His thoughts were no longer clouded by panic. They were sharpened by fury. He had spent years teaching Darian that the world wouldn't always be fair, that some people would see his skin before his soul, that others might test his patience, his strength, his place. But this was different. This man had targeted his son while he carried a baby. The cruelty of it, the recklessness, spoke of something deeper than just rudeness. It spoke of contempt. Marcus took another step forward. Rylan straightened now, trying to match Marcus's growing presence. "Back up," he said, though his voice trembled slightly. "You don't want to do something stupid in front of all these people." Marcus stopped, just long enough to let the man hear his own words echo. Stupid. In front of people. Marcus had always believed in discipline. He wasn't a man who lost his temper. He was a man who planned, who measured, who responded. But something in this moment, something about seeing Darian holding Kai with one arm, the other bent in pain, eyes red with tears, cut through the logic and struck bone. He leaned forward, his voice quiet and deliberate. "You tripped my son." Rylan's mouth twitched. "I told you, I didn't." "You tripped my son," Marcus repeated, slower this time, his voice like a blade being unsheathed. His gaze never wavered. Behind him, Darian watched with wide eyes. The boy wanted to stand, wanted to pull his father back from the edge, but his hand throbbed too violently and Kai pressed tight against him, still trembling. Around them, the terminal held its breath. A few passengers whispered into phones. Security had not yet arrived, but the crowd had formed, watching like theatergoers unsure if the play was real or staged. Marcus's hands clenched into fists at his sides. His body leaned forward slightly, the tension in his shoulders obvious to anyone watching closely. But he didn't strike. Not yet. Instead, he stared directly into Rylan's eyes and let the silence between them deepen. Rylan looked away first. Marcus took one final look at Darian, then back at the man who had hurt his sons. His voice dropped to a whisper, but the words carried farther than they should have. A father's silence often hides the sound of a storm about to break. Rylan smirked, tilting his head with smug amusement as Marcus Voss towered over him, just steps away. "Wasn't me," he said loudly, his voice casual but laced with defiance. The words drifted through the tense air like a match near dry leaves, heard clearly by the gathering crowd. The smirk wasn't just dismissive, it was strategic, a deliberate attempt to shape the story before it could fully unfold. Around them, passengers whispered, their expressions flickering between concern and curiosity. A few already had their phones raised, quietly filming, unsure if they were witnessing a misunderstanding or the start of something much worse. Marcus didn't speak. Not yet. His jaw tightened, the muscles along his neck clenching beneath the collar of his gray shirt. His fists curled at his sides, not in preparation for violence, but to keep himself from erupting. In front of him stood the man who had deliberately tripped his teenage son while he carried a baby, a man who now had the nerve to pretend it hadn't happened. Marcus had seen everything, the timing of the step, the slight pivot of Ryland's foot, the calculated movement that sent Darian and Kai crashing to the ground. And now, the denial, the lie. It wasn't just an insult, it was a second act of harm, one aimed at Marcus's very sense of justice. His gaze scanned Darian, who still lay on the ground clutching his broken arm, his legs sprawled awkwardly, his face pale and sweating. Kai's tiny cries came in jagged gasps, his face red against Darian's chest, small hands still clinging to his brother's shirt. That image, the pain, the helplessness, stabbed at Marcus's chest more deeply than any blade could. Raylan crossed his arms as if bored by the confrontation, throwing a quick glance toward a nearby uniformed staff member who hadn't yet approached. He was baiting Marcus, pushing him into acting first, into becoming the aggressor. Marcus understood the game. He could see the shape of the trap being set around him, just like the ones he had avoided for most of his disciplined life. One wrong move, and the headlines would be written. Man attacks airport worker. No one would care about the child on the ground or the baby in tears, but Marcus wasn't just a father. He was a strategist. His mind sharpened instantly, narrowing in on Ryland like a hunter assessing a threat. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, letting the air settle in his lungs. He began to walk, slowly, deliberately. Each step was measured, each one echoing slightly off the tiled floor, like a warning drumbeat before a storm. His boots struck with a purposeful rhythm, and the murmuring crowd fell silent as if the atmosphere itself sensed something irreversible was coming. Ryland's smirk faltered, just slightly, as Marcus approached. The space between them closed to inches, and Marcus stopped, staring down at the worker. His face remained unreadable, but his eyes held a fire that couldn't be ignored. Raylan tried to mask the flicker of unease with a scoff, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "New kids shouldn't be running in airports," Ryland muttered under his breath, but loud enough for it to land like a slap. The sentence wasn't just a dismissal, it was a taunt. A calculated jab, daring Marcus to lose control. Around them, passengers stiffened. One man slowly stepped backward, clutching his briefcase. A mother pulled her toddler close. Several others whispered, "What's happening?" Or, "Did he just say that?" Marcus didn't blink. His thoughts raced but remained focused. He had spent years teaching his sons about restraint, how to carry themselves with honor, how to avoid letting anger define their choices. But this wasn't a lesson. This was a moment of reckoning. Behind him, Darian's voice was soft, strained but full of pleading. "Dad, don't." The boy's eyes met his father's, wide with fear, not of Marcus, but of what might happen to him if he acted, if he crossed the line, if this turned into something no one could take back. That voice pierced through Marcus like a bell in a fog, grounding him for a brief moment. His son needed him calm. But the storm inside him did not vanish, it simply reformed, tighter, quieter, more precise. This wasn't about rage anymore, this was about justice, about ensuring that a man like Ryland never got to smirk at another hurt child again. The airport's fluorescent lights buzzed softly above, casting a sterile glow over the terminal. The space around Marcus and Ryland became a stage, a charged silence surrounding them like invisible walls. Every breath drawn by the crowd was shallow. Every phone camera was now aimed at them. Marcus took one step closer, barely an inch, but it was enough. Ryland instinctively leaned back, his mouth twitching, the smirk now fully gone. The tension crackled, alive and unspoken. Marcus's voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. "You think I didn't see what you did?" His tone was even, but each word carried the weight of thunder. "You put your foot out. You knew my son was carrying a baby." Ryland opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came. "You wanted to see them fall," Marcus continued, "and now you're pretending it was nothing." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The truth didn't shout, it landed. The surrounding crowd grew stiller, their eyes bouncing between the two men like spectators at the edge of something historic. Somewhere in the distance, the overhead speaker continued its routine boarding announcements, oblivious to the gravity unfolding below. Marcus straightened his shoulders, towering over the worker with the quiet power of a man who had endured far worse, and who would not allow harm to come to his children again. Not while he was breathing. In that suspended moment, everything was perfectly still. The fractured breath of a child behind him, the frozen smirk on Ryland's face, the quiet tick of the seconds before consequence. The weight of Marcus's decision built inside him like rising pressure behind dam walls. It wasn't just about Ryland anymore. It was about every father forced to watch harm done while being told to stay quiet. It was about choosing whether to be remembered for patience or protection. And then, without flinching, he made his choice. He stepped closer once more, and the space between them vanished. The tension in the air was unbearable, like the charged silence before lightning strikes. When lines are crossed, fathers become storms. Marcus stood only inches from Ryland, his breathing even but unnervingly deep. His chest rose with controlled force, and every muscle in his broad frame tensed like coiled wire. The echo of his son's fall, the way Darian had hit the floor, the sound of Kai's terrified cry, still rang in his ears like a warning bell. His eyes, dark and unmoving, drilled into Ryland's with a fury that wasn't loud, but was louder than any scream. "You tripped my son," Marcus said. His voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. The calm was more frightening than rage. It slid through the air like a blade, sharp and undeniable. Around them, a hush had fallen over the terminal. Conversations died mid-sentence. Footsteps slowed. Every eye seemed drawn to the confrontation blooming between the furious father and the man who had dared to harm his children. Ryland, caught off guard by the sheer force of Marcus's presence, hesitated. His smirk, once smug and confident, twitched slightly at the corners. He tilted his head with mock disbelief and threw his hands up in theatrical defense. "Wasn't me," he muttered, his voice just loud enough to carry. "Kids don't watch where they're going." Marcus didn't move. He didn't blink. But something subtle shifted in his stance, a weight rolling forward onto the balls of his feet, a tightening in his shoulders, the kind of adjustment a man makes when he's already decided what comes next. Darian, still cradling his injured hand on the ground behind him, felt the change in his father. "Dad, don't," he whispered weakly, but the words fell into the stillness like a pebble in a canyon. Ryland saw the hesitation in Marcus's face, or at least he thought he did. So he leaned in, just an inch closer, emboldened by the lack of immediate violence. "You gonna make a scene in front of all these people? Over a clumsy kid?" That was the spark. Without a single wasted breath, Marcus surged forward, his left hand shooting out like a piston. He grabbed a fistful of Ryland's uniform collar, yanking the man upward with raw, practiced strength. Gasps exploded from the surrounding crowd like a wave. Phones tilted up, screens lit, recording icons blinking. It didn't matter. Ryland's feet skidded backward, his shoes squealing against the polished tile. His hands flailed in protest, trying to pry Marcus's grip from his collar, but it was like trying to bend steel. Marcus held him with one hand, face to face, his knuckles white with pressure. "I warned them," Marcus muttered under his breath. "One day someone would put their hands on my boys, and I wouldn't hold back." Ryland's bravado dissolved instantly. His face, now flushed and strained, contorted in confusion and rising panic. Hey, let go, security! Someone stop this guy!" But no one moved. The airport was frozen in place. A few officials at a nearby information desk stood rooted, unsure whether to intervene or wait. One older man behind a coffee kiosk peeked out but ducked back behind the machine. Travelers stood with luggage forgotten at their sides, some filming, some whispering, others simply watching. Ryland's voice cracked. "I didn't mean anything. It was just an accident." Marcus didn't blink. He tightened his grip and Ryland let out a sharp, panicked grunt. The worker's hands flailed again, trying to find footing, but Marcus's other hand came up, pressing against Ryland's chest, holding him still. For a moment, everything stopped. Marcus's rage, Ryland's terror, the crowd's breath. Darian watched from the floor, his eyes wide. His casted hand cradled Kai close. He had never seen his father like this, silent but burning, focused like a man cornered by destiny. His father, who taught him restraint, who warned him never to provoke a fire unless he was prepared to walk through it, was now the fire itself. Ryland's knees buckled slightly, unable to escape the strength pinning him in place. "Let go," he shouted. "I'll press charges." "You hear me?" "You already did," Marcus said, his voice low and unshaking, "when you touched my son." Behind them, an airport alarm chimed faintly, triggered somewhere off in the distance, an automated response to a disturbance on the floor. But it didn't break the tension. It only made it more surreal, like music underscoring a slow-burning fuse. Marcus's grip did not loosen. If anything, it grew tighter. Ryland coughed, trying to twist free, but he was powerless against the weight of a father's wrath. The imbalance of power was undeniable. One man fueled by a sense of justice that had been building for years, and the other a coward masked in uniform. Someone in the crowd whispered, "He's not stopping." And it was true. Marcus's eyes were locked on Ryland with a kind of quiet promise, not just of pain, but of consequence. The bystanders watched, most with silent approval. They had seen the fall, seen the baby cry, seen the teen crumpled and broken on the floor. Now they saw a man refusing to let cruelty walk away without cost. The moment was no longer just about punishment. It was about truth standing upright, unshaken and terrifying. Darian, wincing, looked up and whispered to no one in particular, "He's not going to stop." And deep down, he understood why. Marcus's voice dropped again, but this time loud enough for those nearest to hear. "You chose the wrong family." The phones kept recording. The murmurs kept rising, but no one stepped forward. Not yet. They all knew that what they were witnessing was rare, justice, unfiltered and immediate. Ryland whimpered something incoherent, his legs trembling. Marcus leaned in slightly, his tone still calm, still composed. "One man chose cruelty. I choose justice." And with that, he twisted Ryland's collar one more time, forcing him off balance, letting his body slam lightly into the support pillar behind. Ryland yelped, but Marcus didn't flinch. He wasn't done yet. The crowd knew it. The silence stretched out, breathless, and in that stillness it became clear. A storm, once awakened, cannot be undone. Ryland shoved Marcus in the chest with both hands, harder than anyone expected. It wasn't a defensive move. It was an insult, an act of desperation trying to mask arrogance. That push, reckless and loud, echoed through Marcus's body like a final challenge, and it was all he needed to act. Without hesitation, Marcus's instincts took over. He grabbed Ryland's jacket collar with one powerful hand and twisted his torso sharply with the other, slamming the man sideways into the thick marble column behind them. The sound of bone meeting stone rang out like a snapped branch in a dead forest. Sharp, loud, unforgettable. Ryland cried out. It wasn't the scream of a man in control. It was the raw sound of shock and sudden fear. His bravado cracked like glass. The smirk that once curled on his lips vanished as pain surged up his spine. His arms flailed for balance, legs buckling beneath him. But Marcus didn't let him drop. He held him pinned, back arched and body trembling under the pressure. The terminal had fallen into a strange, breathless quiet. Dozens of travelers stood frozen. A few gasped. Some slowly raised their phones, recording the unfolding scene with trembling hands. Others took a cautious step back. A child clutched his father's coat near the snack kiosk. A flight attendant at the far end of the terminal whispered something into his walkie-talkie, eyes wide with disbelief. Marcus leaned in, his face close enough that Ryland could feel every word. His voice was low, quiet enough to draw people closer just to hear, yet sharp enough to cut straight through the noise. "You harmed my sons," Marcus said, the words grinding through his clenched jaw. "Now you'll understand what harm feels like." With that, he shifted his weight. His knee pressed into the small of Ryland's back, forcing his spine into a position that made even the onlookers wince. Ryland cried out again, louder this time, his voice thick with panic. His fingers scraped at the column, searching for something to grip, something to hold on to, anything. But there was nothing. His face twisted, his eyes wild. "Please, stop. I didn't mean," he stammered. Marcus's grip didn't loosen. His arms were locked like iron, every muscle tensed with years of restraint finally breaking. In that moment, he didn't see a uniformed airport worker. He saw a threat. He saw a man who looked at his son as something disposable. He saw indifference. And that was unforgivable. Darian's voice cut through the rising murmur of the crowd. "Dad, stop! Security's coming!" The teen's voice was hoarse, panicked. His arm throbbed with pain, but he dragged himself closer across the floor, still cradling Kai against his chest. His eyes were wide, not just from the physical pain, but from something deeper, worry that he was watching his father disappear into something else entirely. But Marcus didn't hear him. Not fully. All he could hear was Kai's scream, still echoing in his mind from the moment of the fall. That sound had pierced deeper than anything else. It had unlocked something ancient in Marcus. Not anger, not even rage. Something colder, more final. He remembered the lessons from his younger years. Control your strength, control your mind. Never let your hands move before your thoughts. But now, his thoughts were a storm. "Let go of me," Rylan screamed, legs flailing, spine twisting. Marcus pressed in harder. "You wanted them to fall," he growled. "You didn't even care." The weight of the terminal's silence grew heavier. People didn't move. Even the security cameras turned their red eyes toward the scene. A tall man in a maintenance vest whispered to his coworker, "He's going to break him." Rylan gasped. "I didn't know there was a baby, please." Marcus's grip wavered for half a second. Not because he believed Rylan, but because that excuse made it worse. He didn't know there was a baby? That meant he didn't care. That was all Marcus needed to push again. His knee locked, his arms pressed down. Rylan screamed louder than before. It was no longer panic. It was fear. Real fear. Darian's voice came again, weaker this time, but still pleading. "Dad, please. You've made your point." But Marcus was far past points. He was delivering a sentence. He didn't want revenge. He wanted a lesson carved so deep that no one like Rylan would ever forget it, that anyone watching would remember what it costs to harm the defenseless. Security was coming. That much was obvious. Red lights flashed faintly near Gate 12. A voice on the intercom stammered halfway through a boarding announcement, then fell silent. The pressure grew. The moment stretched. Marcus's eyes locked on Rylan's, eyes filled with regret, but not repentance. Eyes filled with fear, but not change. That was the last straw. Marcus leaned in once more, breath steady, voice cold. Some punishments are written in bone, not words. Marcus Voss didn't hear the rising noise of the crowd or the distant blare of security alarms. His full attention was locked on the man pinned beneath him, Rylan Doran, the airport worker who had just shattered the calm of their journey by deliberately tripping his teenage son. Rylan writhed between the polished column and Marcus's arm, now twisted behind his back. The man's earlier smirk was gone, replaced by a mixture of pain and disbelief. His mouth opened to speak, but all that escaped was a strangled gasp as Marcus pressed harder. Then a voice sliced through the noise. "Marcus!" It came like a sudden thunderclap, strong and familiar. Marcus's grip paused but did not loosen as he turned his head slightly toward the sound. Officer Terrell Van was striding quickly across the terminal, a plainclothes badge swinging from his belt, one hand held out in caution, the other pressed against the radio on his shoulder. He was lean and sharp-eyed, his steps filled with urgency and purpose. He had seen the altercation unfold from a distance, and his training had kicked in immediately. But there was something else in his movement, not just duty, but recognition. History. Terrell and Marcus had once served together overseas in a private security detail. They'd guarded embassies, navigated high-risk zones, and shared quiet stories about family during long nights on watch. They were cut from the same cloth, disciplined, loyal, and forged in pressure. But what Terrell saw now wasn't the man he once stood beside in the desert. What he saw was a father on the edge, driven by something far deeper than protocol. "Marcus, let him go," Terrell commanded, his tone steady but urgent as he drew closer. His eyes scanned the scene quickly. Darian was down, clutching his arm, his face twisted in pain. The baby was crying, clinging to his brother's side. Passengers stood frozen, phones raised, recording every second. And in the middle of it all was Marcus, holding Rylan in a grip born not of fury alone, but of instinct to protect. Marcus didn't respond. His eyes were calm, but something fierce still burned behind them. He adjusted his stance, driving his knee deeper into Rylan's back, making the man cry out again. Rylan's pleas had shifted from denial to desperation. "I didn't mean to." "It was just a mistake," he gasped, his voice muffled against the marble floor. Marcus's voice came slow and controlled, nearly a whisper, but it carried the weight of thunder. "You could have killed my son." "You think that's a mistake?" Terrell flinched, not from fear, but from the realization that this wasn't a simple case of an angry parent overreacting. This was deeper. This was betrayal. The crowd began to stir louder now, murmurs turning into scattered calls for help, for security, for intervention. Some passengers shouted for the police, others cried out in support. "He's protecting his kid," one man yelled, while a woman nearby clutched her chest, eyes wide. Darian tried to sit up despite the pain, his voice weak but urgent. "Dad, please, they'll take you away." Marcus didn't look back. His hand held firm, knuckles white. Every fiber in his body was torn between reason and rage. He had spent his entire life teaching his sons about self-control, about standing tall in the face of injustice. But now, looking at the man who had brought harm to his boys without remorse, something had cracked. A line had been crossed. A lesson needed to be taught, one the law didn't have time to deliver. Terrell took a cautious step forward, his eyes never leaving Marcus. "I get it," he said quietly, voice low enough to reach only his old friend. "But this isn't the way. Reinforcements are coming, seconds away. You have to stop now, before this becomes something you can't walk away from." Marcus's jaw clenched. He could hear the urgency in Terrell's voice, could feel the shift in the air. But he could also still hear the thud of Darian hitting the floor. He could feel the sharp cry Kai had let out when he fell. Those moments replayed in his head like hammer strikes, pounding away at restraint. Ryland's body trembled beneath him. "Please," he croaked. "I didn't know. I didn't think the baby would get hurt." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "That's the problem. You didn't think at all around them." Security uniforms began appearing at the edge of the terminal. Officers shouted through radios, pushing through the crowd. People pointed, voices rising. The chaos Marcus had contained for so long now surrounded him. Terrell waved one hand in the air, signaling the others to hold back. "I can talk them down," Terrell warned softly, still trying to reach the part of Marcus that hadn't been buried in fire. "But you have to end this now." For a brief second, Marcus's fingers twitched. He considered it, letting go, standing down, trusting that justice would be served in a boardroom or courtroom. But then Ryland twisted slightly, trying to shake loose, and in that instant, Marcus felt the threat again, not just to his sons, but to every father who'd ever been told to calm down in the face of harm. His grip tightened once more. Terrell took another step, his eyes darkening. "Marcus!" But it was too late. Marcus leaned in close and, with a sharp, brutal motion, twisted Ryland's torso to the side. The snap was audible. Screams erupted through the terminal. Some passengers ran, others froze in place. Ryland's body sagged, his back arched awkwardly, a strangled cry escaping his throat as he collapsed fully to the ground. His legs twitched once, then went still. The pain etched across his face was pure and unmistakable. Terrell froze, his hand halfway extended. A second too late. Phones were everywhere now, catching every angle. The moment had passed from confrontation into something irreversible. Marcus turned, chest rising and falling with quiet intensity. His gaze scanned the crowd briefly before settling on Darian and Kai. His boys were safe. That was what mattered. He stepped away from Ryland's crumpled form and knelt beside his sons, whispering softly to them, trying to offer comfort in the storm he had just unleashed. He knew the cost, knew what would come next, but in his heart he felt no regret. Not yet. Terrell finally lowered his hand, his voice quiet and filled with something like sorrow. A father does not negotiate with cruelty, he ends it. He thought laughter and cruelty in the terminal would go unanswered, but justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe every act of abuse must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. The sound cracked through the terminal like a gunshot. Marcus had moved without hesitation. His arms, once steady and disciplined from years of quiet strength, acted on pure instinct. In one swift motion, he seized Ryland's torso and twisted it with brutal force. The noise that followed, the audible snap of vertebrae locking against nature, erased every whisper of doubt in the room. The crowd's breath caught all at once, then released in a chorus of gasps and screams. Ryland's body buckled immediately. His legs collapsed under him, and he dropped like a marionette with its strings severed. One of his arms flailed aimlessly before folding beneath him. The unnatural arch of his back twisted sideways, his mouth opening in a silent cry before the pain found its voice. A long, guttural groan spilled out as he rolled onto his side, unmoving except for the tremors running through his fingers. His eyes were wide with disbelief, the smirk long gone, replaced now by the dawning terror of a man who realized that his cruelty had summoned a reckoning far greater than he anticipated. Darian, still seated on the cold tile with Kai clutched tightly against him, stared with eyes full of shock and conflicted emotion. His broken wrist throbbed, but the pain was secondary to what he had just witnessed. "Dad," he whispered, barely audible, the word half plea, half question. His lips trembled, not out of fear for his father, but from the overwhelming truth that someone had finally defended him without hesitation. Justice had been sudden, severe, and unforgettable. Across the terminal, phones were everywhere, raised above heads, pointed like weapons of accountability. The grainy screens recorded the moment in dozens of angles, Marcus's grip, the twist, the fall. There was no ambiguity left. No way to frame this as a misunderstanding. The punishment had been recorded in sound and motion, and it would live far beyond this airport floor. Terrell Van, still mid-stride, froze in place as the reality struck him too late. His arm had been outstretched, ready to de-escalate. But now, his hand hovered uselessly in the air like a question mark, one that had come seconds too slow. He looked down at Rylan writhing on the floor, then up at Marcus, who stood over the man like a statue carved from fury. Terrell's mouth parted, but no words came. His instincts, honed over years in law enforcement, screamed at him to act. Yet something deeper, a memory of Marcus, the man he once knew, held him in place. Screams echoed off the terminal's high glass walls. Some passengers rushed to exits, suitcases abandoned mid-roll. Others ducked behind chairs or kiosks. But not all ran. A few men, scattered among the chaos, stood rooted, arms folded or hands in pockets, silent witnesses to what they quietly deemed justice. One of them, a gray-haired man near a vending machine, gave a subtle nod that only he understood. Marcus's chest rose and fell, his breath uneven, his hands trembling, not from weakness, but from the fading shock of what he had done. He looked down at them, at his fingers which still tingled from the moment of impact. The adrenaline hadn't yet worn off, but the consequence was already settling in. He hadn't planned to hurt Rylan like that. He had only wanted the man to feel the weight of what he had done to his children. But something had snapped, inside both of them. "Dad!" Darian's voice pierced the noise again, louder this time. "Dad, is he?" He couldn't finish the sentence. Marcus turned, the heat in his eyes cooling just enough to see clearly again. He stepped away from Rylan's twisted form and dropped to his knees beside his son's. Kai, still nestled in Darian's lap, whimpered softly but had stopped crying. Marcus placed a hand gently on Darian's shoulder and another on Kai's small back. "It's going to be all right," Marcus whispered, barely managing the words. His voice was hoarse, shaky. He didn't know if the promise was true, but he needed his sons to believe it. Darian looked into his father's eyes and nodded faintly, still processing everything. Around them, the chaos hadn't stopped. Footsteps pounded on tile as security forces converged. Voices barked through radios. The red emergency lights near the concourse entrance began to flash, but in the small circle that enclosed Marcus and his boys, there was only stillness, an island of resolve inside a storm of confusion. Terrell took a hesitant step forward, speaking low but urgent. "Marcus, don't move." Marcus didn't look at him. His focus was on Darian's tear-streaked face, on Kai's shallow breathing. He knew the moment of peace was about to end. The law would come for him. Protocols would be followed, papers would be filed, and debates would rage. But in his heart, he held no regret. The moment had demanded action, and he had given it. Somewhere in the distance, a mother clutched her son closer. A man put down his phone and whispered, "He did what any real father would." But Marcus wasn't thinking about the crowd anymore. He was thinking about the line he had crossed, the invisible boundary between patience and justice, between restraint and wrath. It wasn't a line that could be uncrossed. He didn't look back at Rylan again. He knew. Some lines, once crossed, redraw a man forever. Weapons were drawn before the blood had dried on the floor. "Step away from him." "Hands where we can see them," one officer shouted, voice cracked by urgency, his arms rigid as he pointed his sidearm at Marcus. The screech of shifting boots, the rustle of nylon vests, and the chorus of overlapping commands echoed off the glass walls of the Kessler International Airport terminal like 100 alarms at once. Dozens of passengers screamed or ducked for cover behind chairs and kiosks, some frozen mid-step, others rushing for exits. Bags tumbled from conveyor belts, carts were abandoned mid-roll. Marcus didn't flinch. He remained crouched beside his sons, one arm stretched protectively in front of Darian and baby Kai. The chaos swirled around him, but inside his mind, There was only one focus: keep them safe. His body shielded the boys like a wall, as though if he were to stand, the bullets would fly and the narrative would collapse into a headline he couldn't control. Darian's breathing was shaky. His casted arm curled around Kai's body like a brace. The baby's sobs had softened into hiccuped gasps, but his little hands were still clutching Darian's shirt in terror. Blood stained the tile near them from Darian's fall, small but stark, like punctuation at the end of a cruel sentence. "Marcus, don't move," came a voice. It was Officer Terrell Van. Terrell pushed through the tightening circle of officers, his badge clipped low, his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. He moved with the urgency of someone trying to prevent the world from snapping in half. "I know him," Terrell barked. "Lower your weapons." I said lower them. He's not a threat. His voice cracked the rhythm of fear in the officers' ears, momentarily disrupting the crescendo. But not all of them listened. One officer, younger, eyes wide and fingers twitching on the trigger, kept his aim squarely on Marcus's chest. "Back up, sir, or we'll restrain you," the young officer warned. Marcus didn't respond to him. His eyes stayed locked on his son's. He whispered to Darian without looking away from the barrel pointed at his heart. "Don't move. Keep him close." "No matter what," Darian nodded, lips trembling, face pale. Reeland's groans behind them added to the noise. His body still collapsed near the pillar. The security worker's spine was visibly crooked, his breath catching in painful stutters. And yet, even with his pain, his eyes darted toward Marcus, filled not with remorse, but with disbelief, as if he couldn't fathom how quickly the tables had turned. The crowd surged with voices. "He attacked him!" "No, that worker tripped the boy first. I saw everything." Confusion danced through the terminal. Every second stretched into eternity, the truth on the verge of being rewritten by whoever shouted loudest, or by whoever held the gun. And then, cutting through the storm, came a man's voice, measured, firm, and undeniable. "I saw it all. That worker tripped the boy on purpose." Heads turned. A tall man in a charcoal blazer stepped forward from the crowd. He held up his phone like a torch in the dark. The screen was still recording, the image visible. Darian walking. The calculated foot of Ryland thrusting out. The fall. The baby's scream. A second clip played automatically, showing Marcus shielding his sons before confronting the airport worker. The man's voice rose. "You need to see this before you arrest anybody. That father didn't attack first. He reacted after his kid was hurt. You're looking at the wrong threat." One of the senior officers rushed over, snatching the phone from the man's hand and stepping back to the others. The footage began playing in real time, no edits, no filters, no doubts. Terrell stepped in closer to Marcus, lowering his hands now but keeping his voice level. "You need to breathe, brother. You're surrounded, but this might turn it." Marcus exhaled deeply through his nose, a slow, heavy breath like he'd been holding it since the moment Darian hit the floor. Still crouched, he glanced around. More phones were raised now. Strangers who had fled were returning, eyes wide, some recording, some crying, a few nodding as if silently cheering. Another officer lowered his weapon, murmuring to his partner, "It's true. It's all here. He did trip the kid." Rewinded inside the circle of guns and fear, Marcus Voss slowly stood. His hands were raised now, not in surrender, but in control. He looked at his sons, at Terrell, and then directly into the cameras that documented every breath. The tide had not turned fully, not yet, but for the first time since the fall, the world tilted slightly toward truth. Terrell turned to the rest of the team and shouted, "Everyone stand down until the full footage is reviewed." That's an order. One by one, weapons were lowered. Not dropped, not holstered, but lowered. The moment held its breath, and in that fragile pause between judgment and justice, Marcus knew the battle wasn't over, but the weight had shifted. Justice sometimes hides in the hands of strangers. Marcus stood tall as the circle of officers closed around him, their black boots stomping against the polished floor, forming a barrier of authority that shimmered with tension. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, casting harsh shadows across the faces of men whose hands hovered near their weapons. His sons sat just behind him, Darian cradling Kai with his good arm, his broken hand wrapped tightly against his chest. The boy's face was pale but determined, his jaw set in the same quiet strength his father carried. Kai's cries had faded into soft whimpers, his small body pressing closer to Darien as though sensing the storm still raging around them. The air itself seemed to vibrate, thick with fear, anger, and uncertainty, as every pair of eyes, passenger and officer alike, remained locked on Marcus. Terrell Van stepped in front of Marcus, his broad shoulders tense as he raised both hands, palms outward, demanding stillness. His voice carried above the restless murmurs. "Hold your fire." No one moves until the footage is reviewed. His tone was steady, but there was a tremor beneath it, the sound of a man torn between duty and loyalty. The circle of officers hesitated, their fingers twitching against holstered weapons, their orders clashing with the unshakable presence of a father who refused to bow. From the crowd, the businessman who had stepped forward earlier thrust his phone toward one of the senior officers. "Here, watch it for yourself." His words cracked through the noise, drawing stares from passengers who shifted uneasily. The officer, a stern man with close-cropped hair and a tight jaw, took the phone with reluctant hands. His thumb hovered over the screen, the weight of protocol pressing against the raw urgency of truth. The screen lit up, shaky but undeniable. It showed the deliberate thrust of Ryland's foot, the brutal fall of Darien, the sharp cry of the baby, and finally Marcus's storm breaking loose in fury. Gasps rippled through the ring of officers as the reality unfolded, frame by frame. A few lowered their weapons slowly, the metal glint fading as their arms eased downward. Others kept their grips firm, unsure of how to balance the rules they had sworn to uphold with the justice playing out in front of them. Marcus did not flinch, did not plead. His wrists lifted slightly, palms open, a silent gesture of surrender that spoke louder than words. His gaze never wavered from his son's. He saw Darien's eyes glistening with both pain and pride, the boy's lip trembling as he whispered to Kai, "It's okay. Dad's right here." The broken hand throbbed in time with his heartbeat, but Darien's voice was steady enough to anchor the infant in his arms. Terrell's eyes darted between Marcus and the officers, his voice breaking the silence again. "You see it now." He was provoked. "That worker started this. You can't treat him like a criminal without seeing the whole story." His words struck like stones against the uneasy faces around him. The senior officer exhaled heavily, the kind of breath that came from realizing the truth could not be ignored. Still, his duty pressed down like iron. "Protocol requires restraint," the officer said, his voice flat but weighted. He stepped forward cautiously, cuffs glinting in his hand. For a moment, the entire terminal seemed to hold its breath. Would Marcus resist? Would he lash out again? The question hung in the air, heavy as a blade. But Marcus simply extended his wrists without resistance, his movements slow, deliberate, almost regal. The cold metal closed around him, biting into skin already raw from earlier cuffs. He did not break eye contact with Darien. To his son, his stare was not one of defeat, but of assurance, a promise unspoken, that this was not the end. Passengers whispered among themselves, their voices weaving a tapestry of divided judgment. "He snapped." "He's dangerous," some muttered, shaking their heads. "No," others whispered, "he defended his child." Any man would have done the same. The sound of shifting opinions grew louder than the officer's orders, and though Marcus was bound, it was clear his story had already taken root in the minds of strangers. As the officers prepared to escort him away, Darien leaned closer to Kai, clutching him tighter, but his eyes stayed fixed on his father. There was fear, yes, but also something brighter, a flicker of pride, a dawning understanding of the cost of standing tall in a world that too often punished courage. Marcus felt the stares of hundreds pressing into him, some condemning, some admiring. Yet he knew his fate would not be decided here, not in this ring of steel and voices. His future would be carved in the rooms where stories were twisted, in the courts where truths battled lies. The thought steadied him, just as much as the sight of his sons sitting in the fragile calm behind him. The officers closed ranks, guiding him toward the exit, the whispers of the crowd swelling into something heavier than any chains. Every eye in the terminal followed. Some would forget, some would condemn, but others would remember him as the father who refused to let cruelty pass unchallenged. And as the moment settled into silence, one truth became undeniable. The world would not forget what had been witnessed here. Every battle fought in public is judged in silence first. Marcus sat in the stark interrogation room, the dim light overhead casting sharp lines across his face. His wrists, raw from the cuffs, bore the red imprints of restraint, but his posture remained unbroken. His broad shoulders squared as though he carried not only his own weight but the burden of everything that had just unfolded. The room was cold, the kind of chill that seeped into bones, but Marcus's silence radiated its own heat, a quiet defiance that made the investigators on the other side of the table shift uncomfortably. The screen flickered again as the footage replayed. Every second seemed to hang heavier in the air, the deliberate extension of Ryland's boot, Darian's stumble, the baby's cry, the crash against the hard floor, and finally, Marcus's explosive response. The room was silent except for the soft mechanical hum of the monitor, but silence was not peace, it was judgment, stretched thin and waiting to break. Across from Marcus, 3 investigators watched, their faces a study in conflict. One tapped a pen against his notepad nervously, his lips pressed thin. Another leaned forward, elbows on the table, his eyes narrowing as if searching for a justification he already doubted existed. The third, Lieutenant Arden Cross, broke the stillness by leaning back in his chair and folding his arms. His gaze was sharper, heavier, as though he had seen this game played out before. Tyrell Van stood to Marcus's right, arms crossed, his tone steady but urgent as he spoke. "You've seen the footage. You know what happened. This man is not reckless. I served with him overseas. He doesn't lose control without reason. That worker targeted his son, and Marcus reacted. Any father would his words carried weight, not just from loyalty but from truth forged in years of shared duty. Yet the silence that followed told Marcus that truth and justice did not always walk hand in hand." The pen-tapping officer finally spoke, his voice tight with skepticism. "Reaction or not, you broke the man's spine. That's excessive, and you know how the public will see it." His words hung like smoke, filling the space with the foul taste of accusation. Marcus didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the monitor, watching the same images again, but this time through a colder lens. He replayed every movement in his mind, his son's cry, his own fury boiling over, and the irreversible snap of bone. Arden leaned forward then, his voice low, steady, carrying the weight of something more dangerous than skepticism. "Don't fool yourself, Marcus. This isn't about truth. The airport authority isn't going to let this play out fairly. They'll protect their name before they protect your family. They'll cut the footage into pieces, leak the parts they want, and paint you as a violent man who snapped in public." He let the words linger, studying Marcus's face for a reaction. Marcus finally lifted his head, his dark eyes meeting Arden's with an unflinching calm. "And the part where my son was tripped? Where the baby hit the floor? You think they'll bury that too?" His voice was low, almost dangerous in its quiet control, but it was also tired of fighting battles where the truth was never enough. Arden's jaw tightened. He didn't answer immediately, and the silence was answer enough. He leaned closer, his words now carrying the weight of warning. "They'll bury anything that makes them look weak. You've been in systems like this before, Marcus. You know how they work. They will rewrite this, and by the time it hits the public, you'll be the villain, not the victim. That's how they survive." The tension in the room pressed heavier. Marcus's mind sharpened, each thought sliding into place with precision. He had fought wars where the battlefield was clear, where enemies wore uniforms and the stakes were survival. But this was different. This was a war of shadows and stories, where truth could be erased as easily as a line wiped from a screen. He felt the weight of his sons even now, their cries still echoing in his chest. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about whether the story of what happened today would live or be buried alive. Tyrell placed a steady hand on Marcus's shoulder, grounding him for a moment. "We'll fight this," he said firmly, his voice carrying the conviction of a brother in arms. But even he knew the battlefield they were stepping into was treacherous. In another room down the hall, Darian lay in a medical cot, his broken hand wrapped in a temporary cast. His face was pale from the pain, his voice weak as he whispered to the nurse tending him. "If I had been stronger, maybe Dad wouldn't have had to do it." His words carried the guilt of a boy too young to bear such weight, and yet they cut like a blade through the sterile quiet. Back in the interrogation room, Marcus closed his eyes briefly, his breathing steady, his body rigid but his thoughts alive with fire. He knew what Arden said was true. His fight would not end with handcuffs or an interrogation. It would spread into courts, newsrooms, and whispers in the streets. This wasn't a battle for his freedom alone. It was a battle for the story itself, for the truth of a father who refused to let cruelty walk free. Arden's voice, steady and grim, echoed like a final prophecy as the investigators exchanged uneasy glances. Your fight won't be for freedom alone. It will be for the story they try to erase. The morning after the incident, the world erupted. Marcus Voss woke up not to silence but to the sound of his name echoing from a nearby television. News anchors across networks shouted over one another, their words sharp and hurried. Violent father assaults airport employee, one report declared, while another followed quickly. New footage suggests airport worker targeted teen before father's outburst. The camera footage had spread like wildfire, some clips edited, distorted, only showing Marcus slamming Rylan into the pillar. Others, uncut, started at the very beginning. Rylan stepping into Darian's path, his boot jutting out just as the boy cradled his baby brother. Those videos painted a different picture. A father pushed to the edge, forced to choose between restraint and protection. Marcus sat at the edge of his bed, his face buried in his hands. The cuffs had left faint bruises on his wrists, and his shoulders ached from hours in interrogation. Yet none of that compared to the weight in his chest. Across the living room, Darian sat on the couch, his arm in a fresh white cast, gently rocking baby Kai, who was finally asleep. The television glowed in front of him, casting shadows across his tired face. He hadn't spoken much since they returned home. "Dad," Darian said softly, not turning away from the screen. "They're calling you dangerous." Marcus looked up, his voice steady. "I know." The screen cut to another panel. This time, 3 commentators in suits debating whether Marcus should face prosecution. "He snapped," one man argued. "I don't care what provoked it. Snapping like that is unacceptable." "But if someone tripped your son while he carried a baby," another interjected, raising his voice. Marcus rose to his feet and turned the television off with a firm click. "They're not looking for the truth," he said. "They're looking for something to sell." The silence returned until it was broken by the phone ringing in the next room. Marcus answered it. The voice on the other end was breathless, hurried. "You need to come down to the station," said Terrell Van, the officer who had tried to de-escalate the terminal chaos. "Something's changed." "There's a new witness." Marcus's pulse jumped. "A witness?" "Yeah," Terrell confirmed, "and not just anyone." "You'll want to hear this in person." Marcus hung up, told Darian he'd be back soon, and left the house with a silent prayer that the tide was finally turning. At the airport's administrative building, tension clung to the air like smoke. Inside the conference room, 6 officials sat around a long table, their faces pale. They hadn't expected the story to spiral this fast. They'd tried drafting a statement all night, carefully worded, neutral, deflecting blame, but the internet had already torn that apart. Now, their public relations manager was fielding media calls from 3 countries. And worse, something had just landed in their laps that they couldn't ignore. The door creaked open. Corvin Hale stepped inside, wearing the same faded blue janitor's uniform he'd worn for decades. His steps were slow, careful, but his eyes, pale gray and unwavering, cut straight to the heart of the room. In his hand, he carried a small flash drive. One of the directors rose. "Mr. Hale, we appreciate you coming, but we're in a sensitive position right now." "I know exactly what position you're in," Corvin replied, voice gravelly but firm. "And I know what I saw." The room stilled. "I've worked this terminal for 30 years, Corvin continued. "Seen all kinds of people pass through, but I've never stood by while a boy carrying a baby gets knocked down by one of our own." He placed the flash drive on the table. This came from the maintenance corridor's security feed. "It's a different angle, shows exactly what that man did to that child." The officials exchanged glances. One of them swallowed hard. Another reached for the drive and plugged it into the nearest laptop. The footage played. No commentary, no edits. Just a silent recording. Darian approaching. Kai snug against his chest. Rylan stepping forward and kicking his foot out. The boy falling. The baby crying. Rylan's smirk. And then Marcus's eruption. Controlled, deliberate, powerful. When the clip ended, no one spoke. The evidence was undeniable. The story they'd been preparing, the one where Marcus was cast as the aggressor, was now a lie. Corvin spoke again, his gaze unwavering. "You can't bury this." "Not anymore." Later that evening, Marcus returned home. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that waits for resolution. Darian was in the living room, television on again, though the volume was low. "Where'd you go?" the teen asked, glancing up. Marcus lowered himself onto the couch beside him. The truth showed up. On screen, a news anchor broke in with a new update. "We have breaking developments in the Marcus Voss airport incident," he said. "A janitor named Corvin Hale, a 30-year veteran of Kessler International, has come forward with new video footage. The video clearly shows the airport worker deliberately tripping 16-year-old Darian Voss, who was carrying an infant. Public reaction has been swift. The channel cut to reactions from social media, then to legal analysts revising their takes. The tone had changed. Marcus was no longer a man defined by a single violent moment, but a father responding to one." Darian looked down at his cast, his voice hesitant. "If I hadn't fallen, you wouldn't have had to." "Stop," Marcus interrupted, firm but gentle. "You protected your brother. You did everything right." Darian nodded slowly, his eyes glinting with something new, not just pain, but understanding. The room grew quiet again. Not the silence of fear, but the kind that comes before a verdict, before the world decides who you really are. A moment later, the screen flashed with a new headline. "Whistleblower testimony confirms airport cover-up attempt." Marcus exhaled deeply. For the first time, the weight on his shoulders didn't feel so crushing. Darian turned to look at him, admiration written all over his young face, and though Kai slept soundly in a crib nearby, the lesson etched into that room would stay long after the broadcasts ended. Sometimes, the truth doesn't just escape, it storms the gates. The gavel struck once. The sound echoed through the quiet courtroom like a drumbeat, final and absolute. Marcus Voss didn't flinch. He stood tall at the defendant's table, hands at his sides, the sleeves of his suit still creased from the tension of the past weeks. The judge's voice carried clear and heavy, resonating across the polished wooden walls and down to every seat in the gallery. "Mr. Voss," the judge began, his eyes stern but not without a trace of empathy. "This court recognizes that you acted in a moment of intense provocation. While your actions were severe, the circumstances surrounding them were equally extraordinary." Marcus said nothing. His jaw was locked, his chest still, but his heart pounded with a quiet rhythm only he could feel. He didn't turn to look at the gallery, though he knew exactly who sat there. Darian, his right arm still bandaged and held close to his chest, sat beside a quiet, wide-eyed Kai. The boy was cradled in the arms of a male child advocate who had volunteered to sit with them. Darian held his brother close with his good arm, nodding slightly when Marcus glanced his way for only a second. "The court does not find you without fault," the judge continued, adjusting his spectacles and glancing at the case files again. "But it finds that the fault of the airport authority and the deliberate aggression by the employee Mr. Doran significantly contributed to the events that unfolded." There were murmurs throughout the gallery, reporters shifting in their seats, legal interns whispering, one court officer tightening his grip on the radio at his side, but all of it blurred into background noise for Marcus. The judge leaned slightly forward. "Therefore, this court sentences you to 1-year probation, supervised, with mandatory anger management counseling. You will not serve prison time." A soft gasp escaped from the back row. Somewhere, someone let out a relieved breath, but Marcus didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't even blink. The judge wasn't finished. "The court also issues a formal rebuke to the administration of Kessler International Airport," the judge declared, shifting his attention toward the observers representing the airport authority. 3 suited men, all stiff and pale, sat frozen on the opposite side of the room. "Your failure to screen, supervise, and discipline your employees has led to gross negligence and public endangerment. A full reform of your worker oversight procedures is hereby ordered." One of the suits, Deputy Director Landon Clay, tugged at his collar, his face paling further. He had fought hard behind the scenes to label Marcus as a danger, but the new footage, the witnesses, the public outcry, it had all unraveled their defense. "And finally," the judge said, his tone quieting now as if burdened by what came next, "we acknowledge the life-changing injuries sustained by Mr. Ryland Doran, though he remains under investigation for instigating this incident. Regardless of outcome, he will require long-term care. Let him be a lesson in the consequences of arrogance wrapped in a uniform." Across the courtroom, in a hospital bed wheeled into the rear of the chamber, Ryland lay strapped and immobile. His spine was braced, a breathing tube clipped near his nostrils, eyes dull and locked ahead. The smirk that once lived on his face had vanished weeks ago. Now there was only regret and pain. The courtroom was dismissed. Marcus turned slowly. For a moment, the world seemed to move slower around him, court officers stepping out, legal aides gathering documents, reporters rushing toward the exits. But his focus was only on two faces, his sons. He crossed the room in long strides, and Darian stood as best he could, careful not to jostle Kai, who now blinked up at their father with tired but safe eyes. Marcus placed a hand gently on Darian's shoulder, then leaned in to kiss Kai's forehead. "You're both all right," he whispered, more to himself than to them. "We're okay, Dad," Darian said, his voice steady. "You brought us through." Marcus nodded, but a shadow still lingered in his eyes. Outside the courthouse, the cameras were already rolling. Protesters and supporters stood side by side, signs lifted high, some condemning, others praising. The debate had already begun across the nation. Was Marcus Voss a father defending his children, or a man who lost control? But Marcus didn't care what they called him. Back at home that night, the silence was soft and complete. The city outside their windows hummed quietly, but inside the apartment, the only sound was the occasional rustle of the couch cushion, the slow ticking of the clock. Darian sat beside his father on the couch, his arm in a sling, Kai asleep against his lap. The cast on his hand made everything harder, but he said nothing about the discomfort. Marcus stared out the window for a long time. His hands rested on his knees, fingers still trembling slightly, not from fear, but from all that had passed. There had been too many moments he couldn't undo, too many times he'd had to choose instinct over protocol. "You think people will ever stop talking about it?" Darian asked quietly. "No," Marcus said, "and they shouldn't." The boy looked down, unsure. "Because some things," Marcus continued, "aren't meant to be forgotten." "They're meant to remind," Darian nodded. Kai stirred slightly but stayed asleep, safe. Marcus closed his eyes for a long moment, then opened them again, gaze steady. He wasn't a perfect man, but when the moment demanded it, he had stood tall. He had been the wall, and the storm that nearly took his sons had stopped with him. Justice, once carved in bone, leaves echoes that never fade. Seconds later, the father struck back. The same floor where his sons bled became the workers' downfall. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of racism, humiliation, and sudden accountability for unchecked prejudice. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic injustice, provoke thought on abuse of authority, and inspire action toward dignity, justice, and reform.